In the center of Concord Station stood a figure that had not moved in 12,000 years. And in all that time, not a single creature in the galaxy had thought to ask it a simple question about how it felt inside its ancient heart. The station itself was massive beyond imagination, a city floating in the void between stars, where 1,000 different species came together to trade and talk and make deals that shaped the fate of entire worlds. It was the heart of galactic civilization, a place where the mighty and the humble walked the same halls and breathed the same recycled air. But none of them mattered as much as the statue in the central atrium. They called it the Eternal Guardian, though no one truly knew what it guarded or why it stood there in silence while the ages rolled past like waves on a cosmic shore. It was tall, taller than any building on most planets, and its body seemed to be made of living stone that shifted between black and purple and the deep blue of a dying star. Its eyes were the most unsettling part, for within them swirled actual starlight, galaxies in miniature that spun slowly in those massive sockets, as if the creature held entire universes within its gaze, and those eyes never blinked, never closed, never looked away from some distant point that only the Guardian could see. The legend said it was placed there by the Precursors, the ancient race that had vanished from the galaxy, long before any current species had learned to walk upright. They had been the first, the builders, the seeders of life across 1,000,000 worlds, and then one day they simply disappeared without a trace or a goodbye. All they left behind was the Guardian. Some species worshipped it as a god. The Velith theocracy had built an entire religion around the silent figure, believing it was a deity in deep meditation who would one day wake and grant salvation to the faithful. Their priests spent their lives in the atrium, chanting prayers that echoed off the high ceilings and fell upon deaf ears. Other species feared it. The Crix Collective, a hive mind of insectoid creatures with a talent for war, believed the Guardian was a weapon of unimaginable power waiting to activate. They kept warships in nearby systems, ready to strike if the statue ever showed signs of hostility. Though what their weapons could do against something so ancient and unknown was a question they preferred not to answer. The Orani refused to go near it at all. They were empaths, sensitive to the emotions of others, and whenever one of them approached the Guardian, they would collapse in tears or flee in terror. Something lived inside that stone shell, they insisted. Something so vast and so heavy with feeling that no Orani mind could bear its weight. Scientists from 100 worlds had scanned the Guardian with every instrument they possessed. They had bombarded it with radiation and sound waves and particles that existed only in theory. They had taken samples from the floor around its feet and analyzed the air in its vicinity down to the atomic level. They learned nothing. The Guardian simply stood there, immune to curiosity, indifferent to worship, unmoved by fear. It did not eat or drink or breathe. It did not respond to any stimulus, no matter how extreme. It was, for all practical purposes, the most boring object in the galaxy. And yet no one could ignore it. There was something about the Guardian that pulled at the mind, that made every creature who passed through the atrium look up at its face even when they did not want to. Perhaps it was the size, or the strangeness, or the simple fact of its impossible age. Perhaps it was the way the light seemed to bend around it, as if reality itself was uncertain how to treat this remnant of a forgotten time. The Governing Council of Concord Station had long ago declared the Guardian a protected monument. No one was allowed to touch it, or build near it, or attempt to communicate with it in any way. The rule was simple and absolute, and enforced with the kind of severity usually reserved for crimes against entire species. Do not engage the Guardian. This rule existed not because anyone thought the Guardian would respond, but because they were terrified of what might happen if it did. 12,000 years of silence had created a comfort, a certainty that the statue was nothing more than a relic of the past. And certainties, once established, become precious things that civilizations will kill to protect. So the ages passed, and the Guardian watched. It watched the Veleth rise from primitive tribes to a star-spanning theocracy that controlled a quarter of the galaxy. It watched them fall into civil war and rebuild and fall again, their faith never wavering even as their empire crumbled around them. It watched the Crix evolve from a single hive on a dying world to a collective of billions that moved through space like a swarm of locusts, consuming and growing and fearing nothing except the silent statue that haunted their strategic calculations. It watched the Irani discover their empathic gifts and use them to become the greatest diplomats in known space, their inability to lie making them trusted by all and loved by none. It felt their fear every time one of them hurried past the atrium with eyes averted and hearts racing. It watched wars that burned entire star systems to ash and peace treaties that united ancient enemies in bonds of trade and mutual suspicion. It watched plagues that wiped out billions and medical breakthroughs that saved billions more. It watched the endless dance of civilization as species rose and fell and rose again. And through it all, the Guardian never moved. Not when a Crix assassin tried to destroy it with a bomb that could crack a planet in half. The explosion did nothing, and the assassin was executed by her own collective for the crime of stupidity. Not when a Veleth prophet climbed its body and stood upon its shoulder, proclaiming himself the chosen one who would wake the sleeping god. He died of old age up there, still waiting for a response that never came. Not when the Irani Council sent their strongest empath to make contact, hoping that a direct mental link might succeed where technology had failed. She touched the Guardian and screamed for 3 days straight before falling into a coma from which she never woke. The Guardian simply stood and watched and waited for something that only it understood. And then 30 years before our story begins, a new species arrived at Concord Station, a species so young and so strange that the galaxy did not quite know what to make of them. They called themselves humans. They came from a small blue world on the far edge of the galaxy, a world so insignificant that it had been overlooked by every survey for millions of years. They had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, only recently learned that they were not alone in the universe, only recently begun to take their first stumbling steps into a community that had existed since before their son was born. They were loud and emotional and utterly without the dignity that older species considered essential. They asked too many questions and touched things they should not touch, and formed attachments with a speed that most cultures found alarming. They laughed too easily and cried too freely, and seemed incapable of understanding that some things were simply not their business. The galaxy looked at humanity and saw children playing in a room full of ancient and dangerous things. But children, as the galaxy would soon learn, sometimes see what their elders have long forgotten how to notice. Commander Alara Vance stepped off the transport shuttle and into the overwhelming chaos of Concord Station, with nothing but a duffel bag over her shoulder and a stubborn refusal to be impressed by anything the galaxy threw at her. She had been a soldier before she was a diplomat, had fought in the border skirmishes that plagued humanity's early expansion into space, had lost friends and taken lives, and learned the hard lesson that the universe did not care about fairness or justice or any of the pretty words politicians used to justify their decisions. Now she wore a diplomatic uniform instead of combat armor, and her weapon was words instead of a plasma rifle. But the core of who she was remained unchanged. She was a woman who looked at problems directly and spoke her mind, even when silence would have been wiser. The assignment to Concord Station was supposed to be an honor, a recognition of her years of service and her talent for cutting through nonsense to find solutions that worked. Earth needed representatives who could hold their own among species that had been traveling the stars, while humans were still figuring out how to make fire. Elara intended to be that representative, even if it meant stepping on a few alien toes along the way. Her first week on the station was a blur of meetings and briefings and endless diplomatic functions, where she smiled until her face hurt and pretended to care about the political concerns of species she could barely pronounce. She learned which foes would kill her, and which aliens would take offense if she looked them in the eye, and which corridors were safe to walk alone. She learned about the Velith and their god obsession, about the Krix and their hive-mind paranoia, about the Irani and their unsettling ability to read emotions like others read books. She learned the trade routes and the power structures and the 1,000 unwritten rules that governed life on the station. And she learned about the Guardian. Everyone told her the same thing when the subject came up. Do not approach it. Do not speak to it. Do not even think about trying to make contact. It was ancient and unknown and possibly dangerous. And the last thing humanity needed was to cause an incident with something that predated their entire evolutionary history. Elara nodded and agreed, and filed the warnings away in the part of her brain where she kept all the other rules she intended to evaluate for herself. The central atrium was impossible to avoid. It sat at the heart of the station, like a great plaza, a crossroads through which everyone eventually passed. And there in the center stood the Guardian, massive and silent and utterly still, while rivers of alien life flowed around it without a second glance. The first time Elara walked through the atrium, she stopped and stared at the statue for a long moment, before a Velith priest gently urged her to keep moving. The faithful did not appreciate tourists gawking at their god, and newcomers were expected to show proper respect by ignoring the Guardian entirely. She found this confusing, but did not argue. The second time she passed through, she slowed her pace and studied the Guardian more carefully. It was beautiful in a strange and unsettling way, all sharp angles and flowing curves that seemed to shift depending on the angle of view. The starlight in its eyes swirled slowly, and she could have sworn it was looking at something far beyond the station walls. The third time, she noticed that no one else was looking at it at all. Thousands of aliens passed through the atrium every hour, creatures of every shape and size and color, and not one of them spared even a glance for the ancient figure in their midst. They walked around it like it was a pillar or a fountain, an obstacle to navigate rather than a mystery to ponder. If she had grown up with such a wonder in her city, she would never have stopped staring at it. But these species had lived with the Guardian for millennia, and familiarity had bred a blindness that bordered on deliberate. Days passed, and Elara developed a habit of taking her morning coffee in the atrium, sitting on one of the benches that lined the walls, and watching the Guardian while the station woke up around her. She told herself it was a good place to observe alien behavior, to study the species she would be negotiating with, but the truth was simpler than that. She could not stop looking at the Guardian because something about it bothered her, and she could not figure out what. It was not fear. She had faced death too many times to be frightened by a statue, no matter how ancient or mysterious. It was not awe, though the Guardian was certainly impressive enough to inspire wonder in anyone with eyes to see. It was not curiosity, though she had plenty of questions that would never be answered. It was something else, something she could not name, a feeling that sat in her chest like a stone whenever she looked up at that still and silent figure. On her 19th day aboard the station, Elara finally understood what had been bothering her. She was walking through the atrium, on her way to a meeting with the Orani ambassador, her mind occupied with trade agreements and cultural protocols, when she happened to glance up at the Guardian. The light in the atrium was different at that hour, softer and more golden, and for just a moment, the shadows fell across the Guardian's face in a way she had never seen before. And in that moment, Ilara saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. The Guardian looked tired. Not physically tired, for a statue could not be physical in that way, but something deeper and more profound. There was a weariness in those starlight eyes, a heaviness in those stone shoulders, an exhaustion that seemed to radiate from every inch of that massive form. It was the look of someone who had been standing for too long, waiting for too long, carrying a burden that no one else could see or understand. Ilara had seen that look before. She had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had been on the front lines too long. She had seen it in the faces of refugees who had lost everything and could not find the strength to rebuild. She had seen it in her own mirror during the darkest days of her service. It was the look of someone who desperately needed help, but had given up hope of ever receiving it. The aliens flowed around her like water, oblivious to her sudden stillness, oblivious to the revelation that had struck her like a thunderbolt. They did not see what she saw, could not see it, because they had stopped looking thousands of years ago. But Ilara was human, and humans had not yet learned to stop looking. She stood there for a long moment, staring up at the Guardian, her meeting forgotten, her coffee growing cold in her hand. Around her, the station hummed with the business of 1,000 worlds, but she heard none of it. All she could see was the tiredness in those ancient eyes, and all she could think was a single simple question that had apparently never occurred to anyone in 12,000 years of galactic civilization. Was the Guardian okay? It seemed like such an obvious thing to wonder, such a basic and human response to seeing someone who looked like they were struggling. But the aliens had built religions and war plans and scientific theories around the Guardian, and none of them had ever thought to just ask if it was all right. Ilara made a decision then, standing in the middle of the atrium with the weight of 12 millennia pressing down on her shoulders. It was probably a stupid decision, definitely a reckless one, and quite possibly the kind of mistake that would get her expelled from the diplomatic corps. But she had never been good at ignoring someone who looked like they needed help, and she was not about to start now. Tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow she would do something that no one had done in 12,000 years. She would talk to the Guardian. The next morning came too quickly, and Ilara woke with a knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the station's artificial gravity. She lay in her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, wondering if she had lost her mind somewhere between Earth and the stars. What she was planning to do was foolish beyond measure. Every species on the station had spent millennia establishing rules about the Guardian, rules that existed for reasons she did not fully understand, and she was about to break them all because of a feeling she could not explain. But the image of those tired eyes would not leave her, and the knot in her stomach was not fear, but something closer to determination. She had spent her whole life being told what she could not do, and she had spent her whole life proving those voices wrong. This would be no different. She dressed in her usual uniform, plain and practical, and skipped breakfast because she knew she would not be able to keep anything down. Her hands were steady as she left her quarters, but her heart was beating fast enough that she could feel it in her throat. The walk to the central atrium seemed longer than usual, every corridor stretching out before her like a challenge she had to overcome. Aliens passed her on all sides, going about their business, unaware that a small human woman was about to do something that might reshape their understanding of the universe. Or get herself killed. That was also a possibility. The atrium was busy when she arrived, filled with the usual morning crowd of merchants and diplomats, and pilgrims making their way to wherever the day would take them. The Guardian stood in the center of it all, massive and still, exactly as it had stood for 12,000 years. Ilara paused at the edge of the plaza and took a deep breath. This was her last chance to turn back, to walk away and pretend she had never seen what she saw, to be sensible and safe and forgettable. She had never been any of those things. She started walking toward the Guardian, and the crowd parted around her without noticing. She was small and quiet and moved with purpose, and the aliens had more important things to pay attention to than one human woman on a mission. 10 meters from the Guardian, she stopped. The statue loomed above her, so tall that she had to crane her neck to see its face, so ancient that she could feel the weight of ages pressing down on her shoulders. The starlight in its eyes swirled slowly, endlessly, and for a moment she felt very small and very young. But she had felt that way before, facing enemies who should have been able to crush her without effort, and she had learned long ago that size and age did not determine the outcome of any encounter. What mattered was will, and Alara had plenty of that. She crossed her arms over her chest and tilted her head to one side, studying the Guardian the way she might study a fellow soldier who was trying to hide an injury. "Hey," she said, her voice clear and calm in the bustling atrium. "You good?" The words hung in the air for a moment, simple and strange and utterly out of place in this hall of wonders where species had been praying and studying and fearing for millennia. 3 words, 2 syllables each, spoken in the casual tone of someone asking a friend how their day was going. Around her, the noise of the atrium began to fade. A Velith priest, who had been walking past, stopped mid-step, his sacred text slipping from his fingers to land on the floor with a soft thud. His eyes went wide with horror, as he realized what this human had just done, what blasphemy she had just committed against the sleeping god. A Krix diplomat froze in place, its compound eyes fixed on the scene, its translator buzzing with static as it tried to process the sheer audacity of what it had just witnessed. In its hive mind, 1,000 voices screamed warnings about the weapon that might now activate. An Orani merchant collapsed against a wall, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of emotion that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She clutched her chest and gasped for air, tears streaming down her face without any understanding of why. And still Alara stood there, arms crossed, head tilted, waiting for an answer to her question. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3, and the silence in the atrium grew deeper and heavier with each heartbeat. The crowd had stopped moving entirely, every alien frozen in place, every eye turned toward the impossible scene at the center of the plaza. Alara did not move. She had asked a question, and she was going to wait for an answer, even if it took another 12,000 years. She did not have to wait that long. The first sign was a sound, a deep grinding noise, like continents shifting beneath the surface of a world. It came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floor and the walls and the air itself, shaking loose dust that had settled in the rafters over centuries of stillness. Then the Guardian moved. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, a slight shifting of weight that could have been mistaken for a trick of the light. But it grew more pronounced with each passing second, and soon there was no denying what was happening. The head of the Guardian, that massive sculpture of stone and starlight that had not shifted position since before most species had learned to count, was tilting downward. It moved with the patience of glaciers, with the inevitability of gravity, with the terrible weight of something that had been holding still for far too long. And then those eyes, those swirling galaxies of ancient light, focused on Alara. The Velith priest began to scream prayers. The Krix diplomat sent emergency signals to its fleet. The Orani merchant fainted dead away, and throughout the station, alarms began to blare as sensors detected movement from the one thing that was never supposed to move. But Alara just stood there, looking up at the face now turned toward her, and waited. When the Guardian spoke, its voice did not come from its mouth. It came from inside the minds of every living creature on the station, a presence so vast and so deep that it made the thoughts of mortals seem like whispers in a hurricane. It was not loud, but it was everywhere, filling every corner of every consciousness with words that could not be ignored. "No," the Guardian said, and the weight of millennia pressed down on that single syllable. "I am not." The atrium erupted into chaos. Aliens ran in every direction, some fleeing in terror, others rushing forward to witness the miracle, still others falling to their knees in worship or despair. The station shook with the sound of running feet and screaming voices and alarms that would not stop. But in the center of it all, in the eye of the storm, Ilara Vance stood perfectly still and looked up at the ancient being that had finally answered a question no one else had thought to ask. "Okay," she said, and her voice was steady despite the madness swirling around her. "You want to talk about it?" The Guardian studied her for a long moment, its starlight eyes unreadable, its stone face impossible to interpret. It had existed for so long, had seen so much, had been worshipped and feared and studied by countless species across the ages. But no one had ever asked if it wanted to talk. Something shifted in those ancient eyes, something that might have been surprise or confusion or the faintest glimmer of hope. The grinding sound returned as the Guardian moved again, its massive body lowering itself with aching slowness until its face was level with the tiny human who had broken its silence. "You are strange," the Guardian said, and its voice was softer now, more focused, directed at Ilara alone, rather than broadcast to the entire station. "Your kind has been here for only a moment, and yet you see what others have missed for ages." Ilara shrugged, a gesture so casual that it made several nearby aliens gasp in disbelief. "We're new," she said. "Haven't learned yet what we're not supposed to notice." The Guardian was silent for a moment, considering her words, and when it spoke again there was something in its voice that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like gratitude. "Then perhaps," it said, "you are exactly what I have been waiting for." The chaos around them continued to grow, but Ilara barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the ancient face before her, to the starlight eyes that held pain older than human civilization itself. Security forces were converging on the atrium from every direction, their weapons drawn, their translators screaming contradictory orders as a dozen different species tried to take control of a situation none of them understood. Velith priests were chanting at the top of their lungs, convinced that the end times had finally arrived. Crick soldiers were forming a perimeter, their hive-mind coordination making them move like a single organism with 1,000 bodies. None of it mattered to the Guardian, who had eyes only for the small human woman who had asked the right question. "They are afraid," the Guardian observed, its voice resonating directly in Ilara's mind, a private conversation amid the public pandemonium. "They have always been afraid of me, though I have never given them reason to be." "Fears like that," Ilara replied, keeping her voice calm and conversational, as if they were two old friends catching up over coffee. "People fear what they don't understand, and you're pretty much the definition of not understood." The Guardian made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it came out more like the grinding of ancient gears. "Your kind is direct," it said. "I had forgotten what that was like, to speak with someone who does not wrap every word in ceremony and fear." "Yeah, we're not great at ceremony," Ilara admitted. "Tends to get in the way of actually saying what needs to be said." Around them, the security forces had reached an uneasy standoff. No one wanted to be the first to approach the Guardian, but no one wanted to be seen as doing nothing either. Commanders shouted orders that contradicted each other, and the result was a circle of armed aliens standing at a respectful distance, weapons pointed at nothing, waiting for someone else to make the first move. Ilara ignored them all. She had more important things to focus on. "So," she said, looking up at the Guardian with the same expression she had worn when counseling traumatized soldiers after difficult missions. "You said you're not good. Want to tell me what's wrong?" The Guardian was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, its voice was heavy with the weight of ages. I was created by the Precursors, it began, the first race to achieve consciousness in this galaxy, the ones who seeded life across 1,000,000 worlds and watched it grow with the pride of parents watching their children. They were wise and powerful and kind, and they loved the universe they had helped to create. Elara nodded, encouraging it to continue. She had read about the Precursors in her briefings. Mysterious figures who had vanished so long ago that even their legends had become legends. But they saw something, the Guardian continued, something coming from beyond the edge of the galaxy, something so terrible that even their vast power could not stop it. They knew it would take time to arrive, countless millennia, but they knew it would come eventually, and they knew that when it did, someone would need to be watching. So they made you, Elara said softly. So they made me, the Guardian agreed. They poured their knowledge and their power and their love into my creation, and they gave me a single purpose, to stand watch, to wait, to be ready for the darkness when it finally arrived. The starlight in its eyes dimmed slightly, and Elara could feel the sadness radiating from the ancient being, like heat from a dying star. And then they left. They did not tell me where they were going or why they had to leave. They simply said goodbye and vanished, and I have not seen them since. That's rough, Elara said, and she meant it. Being abandoned by the only beings who had ever understood you, left alone to carry out a mission that might never end. She could not imagine a lonelier existence. I have stood here for 12,000 years, the Guardian continued, its voice growing heavier with each word. I have watched civilizations rise and fall, species evolve and go extinct, stars be born and die in the depths of space. I have witnessed every moment of every life that has passed through this station, felt every joy and every sorrow, and I have been unable to share any of it. You couldn't move, Elara realized. You couldn't speak. My purpose demanded stillness, the Guardian explained. I was meant to watch, not to act, not until the darkness arrived. And so I stood, and waited, and tried not to feel the weight of loneliness crushing me with each passing year. Elara felt her heart break for this ancient being, this eternal sentinel, who had been given the most important job in the galaxy, and then left to do it alone. She thought of all the species who had prayed to it, feared it, studied it, and none of them had ever thought to ask how it felt. That's messed up, she said. That's really, really messed up. The Guardian tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost curious. You are angry, it observed, but not at me. No, not at you, Elara agreed. I'm angry at everyone else. I'm angry at the Precursors for leaving you alone, and I'm angry at every species that walked past you for 12,000 years without ever stopping to check if you were okay. She paused, then added, and I'm a little angry at myself, because I noticed something was wrong days ago, and it took me this long to actually do something about it. The Guardian was quiet for a moment, processing her words, and when it spoke again, there was a quality to its voice that had not been there before, a warmth that seemed to crack the stone of its ancient reserve. In all my years of watching, it said, I have seen countless acts of kindness and cruelty, love and hatred, hope and despair, but I do not think I have ever encountered anything quite like you. Humans are weird, Elara admitted with a small smile. We've been told that a lot since we joined the galactic community. Not weird, the Guardian said. Remarkable. You see suffering and you want to help, even when the suffering belongs to something you do not understand. Even when helping might put you at risk. Elara shrugged. That's just basic decency, isn't it? No, the Guardian replied, and there was wonder in its voice now. Wonder and something that might have been the first stirrings of hope. It is not basic at all. It is rare and precious and beautiful, and I had forgotten that such things still existed in the universe. Around them the chaos was beginning to subside, The security forces had realized that the Guardian was not attacking. The priests had run out of prayers to chant, and even the Crick soldiers had lowered their weapons in confusion. Everyone was watching now, straining to hear the conversation between the ancient god and the tiny human. But the Guardian kept its words private, meant for Alara alone. "I have been so tired," the Guardian admitted, and the confession seemed to cost it something, as if speaking the words aloud made them more real. "So tired of watching without acting, of feeling without sharing, of existing without truly living." Alara reached out and placed her hand on the Guardian's massive arm. The stone was warm beneath her palm, pulsing with a heartbeat that had been keeping time for 12 millennia. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "I know I'm just one human, and I know I can't compare to what you've been through. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The Guardian looked at her hand, so small against its ancient form, and something changed in its eyes. The starlight, which had been cold and distant for so long, began to warm, taking on a golden hue that seemed to fill the entire atrium with gentle light. "Thank you," it said, and those two words carried more weight than any prayer or curse or scientific theory ever had. "Thank you for seeing me." Alara smiled up at the Guardian, this impossible being that had just revealed its broken heart to a stranger. And she felt something shift between them, a connection forming across the vast gulf of time and experience that separated them. "That's what friends are for," she said, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the Eternal Guardian smiled. They talked for 6 hours straight, sitting together in the middle of the atrium, while the rest of the station held its breath and waited for the universe to end. It did not end. Instead, something far more remarkable happened. Alara told the Guardian about Earth, about the small blue world where her species had learned to dream before they learned to fly. She told it about the wars that had nearly destroyed them, and the stubborn hope that had pulled them back from the brink. She told it about art and music and literature, about the strange human compulsion to create beauty even in the midst of suffering. She told it about her own life, her years as a soldier, the friends she had lost, and the battles she had survived. She told it about the guilt she carried for the lives she had taken and the pride she felt for the lives she had saved. She told it about her family back on Earth, her parents who had begged her not to join the diplomatic corps, her sister who had cried when she left for the stars. And the Guardian listened. It listened with the patience of mountains and the attention of a creature that had spent millennia with no one to talk to. It asked questions when it did not understand, offered comfort when her stories grew painful, and shared its own experiences in return. It told her about the precursors, those first children of the cosmos who had loved the universe so fiercely that they had dedicated their entire existence to nurturing it. It told her about the civilizations it had watched rise and fall, the heroes and villains and ordinary people who had lived and died in its silent shadow. It told her about the loneliness that had slowly crushed its spirit over 12,000 years of isolation. They shared stories like old friends catching up after a long absence, and with each passing hour, the tension in the atrium grew less and the wonder grew more. The aliens who had been watching in terror began to lower their weapons and simply observe, their translators struggling to capture the casual warmth of the conversation. When Alara finally stood, her legs stiff from sitting on the hard floor for so long, the Guardian rose with her. But this time, it did not stop at its previous height. It kept rising, unfolding itself, revealing a form far larger and more magnificent than anyone had ever seen. The Guardian had been hunched, Alara realized, hunched under the weight of its burden, curled in on itself like a person trying to disappear. But now, it was standing straight for the first time in millennia, and it was glorious. It towered over the atrium, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, its body radiating light that filled every shadow, and warmed every heart. The starlight in its eyes blazed with golden fire, and when it moved, the station trembled not with fear, but with something closer to joy. Emergency signals flooded out across the galaxy. Fleets were scrambled. Councils were convened. Leaders were woken from their sleep to be told that the impossible had happened. The Eternal Guardian was awake, and no one knew what it would do next. The Velith theocracy declared a holy day and began preparing for what they believed would be the final judgment. Their priests wept with joy, even as they trembled with terror. The Crix Collective activated every weapon in their arsenal, ready to fight or flee depending on what the Guardian chose to do. Their hive mind buzzed with 1,000,000 calculations, none of which could predict the outcome. The Orani huddled together, their empathic senses overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of emotion radiating from the Guardian. But for the first time, the emotion they felt was not the crushing weight of ancient sorrow, but something lighter, something they had never expected to feel from the silent sentinel. Hope. The Guardian walked across the atrium, each step shaking the station to its foundations, and the crowds parted before it like waves before the bow of a ship. It made its way to the great observation window that looked out upon the stars, the same stars it had been watching for 12,000 years. It stood there for a long moment, looking out at the galaxy it had been created to protect, and then it turned back to face the tiny human woman who had broken its silence with 3 careless words. "You asked if I was well," it said, and its voice rang out across the station, broadcast to every mind, every speaker, every screen. In 12,000 years, no creature in this galaxy ever thought to ask that question. They prayed to me and feared me and studied me, but none of them ever saw me as something that could hurt, that could need help. The Guardian looked at Alara with eyes that burned with ancient fire and new warmth. "Why did you ask? Why did you care about the well-being of something so far beyond your understanding?" Alara shrugged, a gesture that looked almost ridiculous given the cosmic weight of the moment. "You looked like you needed someone to notice," she said simply, "and where I come from, that's enough reason to say something." The Guardian was silent for a moment, and when it spoke again, its voice was thick with emotion that transcended language. "The precursors chose me to stand watch because they believed that when the darkness came, the galaxy would need a defender who could not be corrupted, who could not be swayed, who would stand firm against any threat." It paused, and its starlight eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that made her feel like she was being seen down to her very soul. "But they were wrong about one thing," the Guardian continued. "They thought I would need to stand alone. They thought that isolation was the price of strength, that connection was a weakness that could be exploited." The Guardian knelt down, lowering itself until its massive face was level with Alara's, and it placed one enormous hand on her shoulder, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so vast. "You have shown me otherwise," it said. "You have shown me that strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing that others stand with you. You have shown me that the greatest power in the universe is not knowledge or force or time, but simple kindness, freely given." Alara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was a soldier and a diplomat, and she would be damned if she was going to cry in front of the entire galaxy. "I will remember your species," the Guardian said, and its voice carried the weight of a promise that would outlast stars. "When the darkness comes, and it will come, I will not stand alone. I will stand with those who ask, with those who see, with those who care enough to notice when something ancient and strange needs help." It stood again, rising to its full height, and turned to face the watching crowds, the cameras, the billions of eyes across the galaxy that were seeing this moment unfold. I am the eternal guardian, it declared, and its voice echoed across space and time. I was created to watch, to wait, to protect. But I have learned something new today, something that my creators never taught me. The guardian paused, and when it spoke again, its voice was filled with a warmth that made the Velith priests weep, and the Crick soldiers lower their weapons, and the Orani empaths laugh with pure joy. I have learned that protection means more than standing ready to fight, it said. It means seeing those who suffer and reaching out to help. It means asking the simple questions that others overlook. It means being present, being kind, being willing to connect, even when connection seems impossible. The Guardian looked down at Alara one last time, and in its starlight eyes she saw gratitude deeper than oceans, and hope brighter than suns. Thank you, it said, for seeing me when no one else would. Alara smiled up at the ancient being that had become, against all odds and expectations, her friend. That's what we do, she said. That's what humans do. We show up, we ask questions, and we give a damn about the answer. The Guardian laughed then, a sound like stars singing and mountains dancing, and the entire station laughed with it, a release of tension that had been building for 12,000 years. And across the galaxy, on 1,000,000 worlds and 1,000,000,000 screens, creatures of every shape and size and color watched in wonder as the impossible happened. Watched as the eternal guardian, the silent sentinel of ages, the mystery that had haunted their civilizations since before they were civilizations, finally came to life. All because one human had stopped and asked, "You good?" Word spread quickly, as such things always do. The eternal guardian had moved, had spoken, had smiled, and it had done so not for kings or prophets or scientists, not for the powerful or the wise or the worthy, but for a single human woman who had simply noticed that something ancient and alone looked like it needed a friend. The other species did not understand. They could not. Their cultures had taught them that the guardian was something to revere or fear, something beyond their comprehension, something that existed on a plane so far above their own that communication was impossible. Humanity had always understood, because sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is not a weapon or a spell or a technology beyond imagining. Sometimes it is just showing up and giving a damn. And that, the Guardian learned, was what made humans remarkable. Not their strength or their intelligence or their ambition, but their stubborn refusal to walk past someone who looked like they needed help. Even if that someone was an ancient god who had been standing in silence for 12,000 years.